Welcome to Picker's Corner. I'm Scott from Picker's Paradise. I'll be your host yet again today. I got a couple things to talk about today. The first one we're going to get into is this hard hat helmet here, which is from the Willow Springs Plaza groundbreaking, May 15th, 1991. Now, the story behind the piece and the actual coming into my possession is more the interesting part of this story than the actual helmet itself and the Willow Springs Plaza. So if you're not familiar, the Willow Springs Plaza is the little plaza that's located directly north of the Pheasant Lane Mall. It's got the Home Depot there, the liquor store, and a bunch of little building, or like a strip mall kind of set up in between. So that's the Willow Springs Plaza. Now, one of the other interesting things I heard about that area is I had this actually sitting on the table in my shop for probably a couple weeks before today. And during the holiday stroll a couple weeks ago, I actually had a customer come through, notice it, and start telling me some history about that area. He said that, there was something there before the Willow Springs Plaza, of course. And then predating that, he said it was the site of one of the oldest settlements or houses in the Nashua area, dating back to, he thought, the 1600s. Well, unfortunately, I did a little research, not a lot of research, just a little bit of research. Tried scraping the surface, trying to find some information about what he was talking about. Unfortunately, I found some history on Nashua, and it said that the oldest settlements in Nashua were probably between the Salmon Brook and Merrimack River area, which is kind of like by where the Shaw's is now, that Shaw's Plaza, all the way down to into Massachusetts along the Merrimack River, which would be that strip all along the DW Highway. If you're going south, it would be on the west or on the east side, no matter which way you're going. So the east side of the Daniel Webster, which is where this plaza actually is, and is actually one of the ones that's actually set back a little further than some of the others. So evidently there's some history there. It might be fun to research for anybody who's interested. But the story actually behind me coming into possession of the helmet is a little bit more interesting and kind of goes to the whole picking fraternity or brotherhood kind of. So you meet a lot of people in this business, and to me that's one of my favorite parts of being a picker and doing what I do is meeting the people along the way. So I got this from my buddy John. Now John's a retired construction worker. He did a lot of digging and stuff like that back in the day, backhoes, stuff like that. So he has a big collection of stuff that he found while he was working, and it actually got him into the whole antique and picking thing because if he was interested in the history behind all the stuff he was digging up in random sites. So I met John actually through Facebook Marketplace around the time of the pandemic. I had gone to buying a lot of stuff on there because no flea markets, no yard sales. So it was one place where I could actually go to find things. So I found this guy John out in Haverhill, and when it ended up going to his house to pick up a piece, bought a whole bunch of more stuff while I was there, have gone back another, probably about a half a dozen times over the last couple of years. And we've actually become pretty good friends. We joke around a lot. We send each other interesting finds that we come across that we think, he might be interested, that I might be interested in. And he'd actually found this piece at a yard sale over the summer. And he knows that I'm into collecting Nashua things. And so he said, "Oh, I got this. I got a great little thing for you." He's like, "You don't even have to pay me for it." He's like, "It cost me $1 at a yard sale." He's like, "I'll just give it to you, the next time you come out and go picking through my stuff." So, and that's part of what this business is all about. It's the networking, it's the fraternity, it's making something like a business. It's a hobby basically that you can get into and have a lot of fun with and meet a lot of cool people along the way. So I'm glad to have this thanks to my buddy John and the relationship that we had cultivated over the last few years. So be nice to everybody you meet along the way when you're out picking. You won't see eye to eye with everybody. People value different things differently, but you just need to work through that stuff. And usually most of the people you meet in this business are good people. You just got to find the spots where you can, start a relationship and find certain things through certain people. So networking is always important. So that brings us to our second piece here. So these are a few postcards of the old Nashua Manufacturing Company. Now, I was kind of interested in this story, and when I couldn't find a lot of information about the Willow Springs Plaza, I kind of started thinking about, okay, what else do I want to supplement this show with? And I thought, this is a subject Nashua related that I've always wanted to do a little more research on, because I had some experience with some of the Nashua Manufacturing Company stuff. So start the story way back in the beginning. Nashua Manufacturing Company was a cotton textile manufacturer. They were founded in 1823 by a group of three guys, Moses Tyler, Joseph Greeley, and Daniel Abbott. Daniel Abbott was also known actually as the father of Nashua. So there's quite a bit more on him if you want to look up a little bit of history on Mr. Abbott. And just to give you a sense of what was going on in that 1820s, period. So it was a little bit of the, manufacturing boom in the mill towns and stuff like that in America. The Amoskeag Mills in Manchester, they opened in 1810, or were at least founded in 1810. And the Merrimack Mills in Lowell, the famous Merrimack Mills with the Lowell ladies or the Lowell girls, mill girls, stories. That started in 1823 as well. So we're talking in that time period. So if you really think about the landscape of this area prior to like the 1810s, 1820s, there really isn't a whole lot here yet. If you go fast forward, once these mill buildings are built, there's a lot more infrastructure in these cities that have become so much larger than they were back then when they were basically nothing. They were just happened to be on the river, right place, right time. So the Nashua Manufacturing Company buildings were designed by Asher Benjamin. Now, back in these days, like I said, the area was very underdeveloped. And so the project to actually design the mill was not only just designing the mill buildings and how that was going to work, building the power canal to actually get power to the mill, and all those different projects was not the whole scope of everything. So they also, in the planning and actually the plans for the mill building, they actually included building a couple churches, building a few neighborhoods in the surrounding area to actually house and create a little community for the workers that would be in these mill buildings eventually. So if you fast forward to 1825, their first mill building is actually complete. It subsequently burned down in 1856 and was rebuilt the following year in 1857. By 1828, the second mill building was complete, and in 1928 was when they actually really started manufacturing and shipping finished goods out to distributors or actually manufacturing companies to manufacture the actual sheets, blankets, shirts, any kind of cotton textiles that they were building the rolls for. They also, in some of the reading and informational gathering that I did, it also said they did produce some iron items as well. I've seen a couple of the iron items that they manufactured. They were pretty basic, rudimentary, small things. They weren't building, large iron pieces that were actually used in buildings or manufacturing. It was more household items that they were manufacturing. So the building of the canals, like I said, the power canal to actually bring power to the mills, which, the canals are still kind of evident around Nashua if you go out to the Mine Falls area and that kind of thing. Now those canals and the building of the mill buildings drastically increased the size of Nashua. So the number of people living in Nashua, well, actually it wasn't Nashua at that point, it was still Dunstable. So the amount of people living in Dunstable in 1820 was about 1,140 people, which, very small community, even though it took up a lot of land, because back then Dunstable actually had part of Merrimack in it. It actually had part of Dunstable and Pepperell in Massachusetts in it. It actually went into Hudson a little ways, and Hollis as well. So it was actually a larger landmass, and it only had 1,140 people living in it. By the time the 1830s came around, now this is 2 years after they started shipping goods from the Nashua Manufacturing Corp., that the population had jumped up to 2,400 people. So basically, you've more than doubled the size of the population of this relatively underdeveloped area in a short 10-year period. So as you could see, the quick impact that building these mill buildings was starting to have on the area. Now, if you compare that to today, the population in Nashua as of 2021 was about 91,100 people. And like I said, Nashua today, the footprint is a lot smaller than Dunstable was back in the 1830s. Now, 1835 comes around. One of the founders of the project for the Nashua Manufacturing Corp., he also founds the Nashua Bank, which later became known as the Indian Head Bank. Both of those banks actually back then were printing and distributing their own currency, something that was pretty commonplace up till and past the Civil War, but after then it kind of phased out in the late 1800s. So now the Indian Head Bank in Nashua is still there. The structure is still there. It's actually being converted into some apartment building, into apartments right now. It's located right on Main Street and right on the corner of Temple and Main, actually. And if you want to see, some of the old structure, it's still there, still has the bank stuff on it. I believe it still has the old safe inside of it. I don't know if there's going to be a bedroom inside of it someday in an apartment, who knows. But so across the street, there's a bar that is now Casey McGee's. If you go to the upstairs in there actually still is an old large safe from the Indian Head Bank, because the Indian Head Bank had actually built that little additional building way back in the day and used it as kind of like an accounting house, I think, from the stories that I was told. So they had a lot of paperwork over there. They had some stuff stored in safes, evidently. But if you go in there today, you can still go upstairs and the safe is still sitting there in the room. So that's a pretty cool reminder of times back that far. That's still around here in Nashua. So in 1835, also Dunstable at the time has ballooned up even a little bit more, I'm guessing, past that 2,400 number, because they're now the third largest city in New Hampshire behind Dover and Portsmouth, at least in the 1830s. 1836, the third mill building is completed. 1837 is when Dunstable is actually renamed Nashua. So it's actually kind of funny in my mind that Abbott names the Nashua Manufacturing Corp. And the Nashua Bank both before Nashua is the actual city that they're in. So that is probably why he's probably known as being the father of Nashua. Now, a year later, 1838, the Nashua Lowell Railroad is constructed. So before this time, the only way to get access to Nashua or to bring goods and materials in, bulk to the area was via either the Merrimack or Nashua rivers. That was pretty much the only way you could get the large amount of manufacturing materials into or out of, or finished goods out of Nashua. So that was a huge turning point, was to get the railroad to Nashua in 1838, which was, of course, driven by the existence of the Nashua Manufacturing Corp. So if you think about the workforce in the 1800s now, in the first half, or more than the first half of the 1800s, they basically categorized the mill workers as the Yankee mill girls. Very similar to the Lowell mill girls that you hear about that are a little more famous, and you can read a little bit more on that. But basically, most of the employees at the mills in the early to mid 1800s were females between the age of 15 and 30. Later on in the 1800s, it started becoming more heavy with French and Irish immigrants who were coming to the area in that time. And basically, in some of the readings I did, it basically went over the large expansion of Nashua. Not only Nashua, but also this whole area between the Lowell, Nashua, Manchester line, kind of like. And it was, the way that the population was booming because of these mills and all the manufacturing that had come to the area was mostly being filled by immigrant workers, people who were just moving into the States for the first time. And in the late 1800s, that's when you had the French and the Irish. There's a lot of French and Irish history here in Nashua. There's, the French Hill and a lot of other different architectural things that you can see and different names of places based on those different cycles of immigrants. So now, 1847, New Hampshire is actually the first state to pass a labor law restricting workers to 10-hour shifts. There was no real penalties written into the laws as far as I was reading, so there was no real teeth in it. But 3 days prior to that law actually being enacted in New Hampshire, the Nashua Manufacturing Company issued a contract out to all of its workers stating that they could be fired if they refused to work the 13 or 14-hour shifts to which they were previously assigned. The workers didn't take it well, I guess, because a third of them signed the contract and were willing to work, but the other 2/3 didn't. And the mill actually had the company actually had to shut down for a short period of time temporarily until they could figure out their labor issues. Now, this wasn't the first time. This was the first time the mill had labor issues, but it wasn't going to be the last. So in 1860, the first 2 bell towers are erected on the clock tower building. So, which is now known as the clock tower building, the National Manufacturing Company building. So if you look at the current clock tower place today, the steeple that's basically near the entrance, that is now a clock, that used to be a bell tower. And then there's a bell tower by the second entrance a little further over, which is still in the semblance of a bell tower. Now, the first bell tower, the one that actually has a clock in it, was converted in 1880 from a bell to a clock. And in 1913, the clock tower that is now on the furthest east side, when you go down towards Factory Street, that clock was put in 1913. That was actually, I think, known as one of the Mill 7 buildings, I think, was the actual name of it back in the day. Now, in 1915, as the labor force is changing, a lot of Polish and Lithuanian workers, because they're the latest immigrants, the French and the Irish were first, and then the Polish and Lithuanian, the more Eastern European immigrants start making their way into the country. And due to, some more labor issues, they end up going on strike, and at this point they were a major portion of the labor. And again, the company is forced to have a short temporary closure due to lack of labor. But it didn't stop them very long, because after that, the Nashua Manufacturing Company started buying up other mills in the area. So basically, they ended up buying the mills that were on either side of the current clock tower type building. So they ended up buying the Jackson Company in 1916, the Indian Head Mills in 1924, and the Tremont and Suffolk Mills in 1926. So with those acquisitions, the Nashua Manufacturing Company became owned the largest contiguous portion of these properties, and it encompassed about 400 acres along the Nashua River, right up to like the downtown bridge, basically, at the time, or the Main Street Bridge, all along Water Street and things of that nature. Now, a lot of the property that they own is actually still protected land today. Between the actual Mine Falls Park, which was all owned by the Nashua Manufacturing Company, as well as the clock tower buildings, which are, part of Nashua's historic district these days. Fast forward all the way to 1944. All 7 mill buildings that the company has built are all complete and they're in full operation. I found different numbers about the total amount of people that the mills employed. I read one that said at the height there was about 1,000 employees. I read somewhere else that when the mills closed down, there was 3,500 employees that lost their job. I don't know if one count was just the old manufacturing, the old Nashua manufacturing company before the acquisitions, and the other number is post-acquisitions. I'm not 100%, but there's some discrepancies in the numbers. I did read that they consumed about 10,000 bales of cotton every year and produced about 13 million yards of cloth every year. And the different things that they actually manufactured, they manufactured shirting material to be made into shirts, of course, and other garments. They made blanket material, sheets, and they also did some flannels as well as some ironworks as well on the side. In World War II, they received the Army-Navy E Award for excellent production of military equipment. I've actually seen, thanks to Mr. Craig Michaud, who has like a Nashua historic museum in his basement of everything that was Nashua. He actually has some nice blankets that I think were actually made for the war purpose. Some of the blankets he still have the tags on them. They're in their original boxes. It's quite amazing to see. I've never found any Nashua manufacturing company linen or anything like that in the field myself. Something that I always look for, but I guess it's a rarity these days. The company was acquired by Textron in 1945, and they actually ended up closing everything down in 1948 because after World War II, once the soldiers came back and things like that, a lot had changed as far as the cost of labor, especially in the North compared to the South, as well as the cost of raw materials in the North rather than the South. So with cheaper labor, cheaper raw materials, mostly because the raw materials that they were manufacturing with were from the South. So if you take the raw materials from the South, manufacture them in the South, your cost of production is a lot lower. Cheaper labor was down there too, and then also land was a lot cheaper down there. The amount of infrastructure and lack of land that had happened in the Northeast between the 1820s when these projects all started and the 1940s when it all shut down, that 120 years, that population and the infrastructure had just absolutely boomed. So they moved down there. So 6 of the Nashua Manufacturing Company buildings are actually converted into apartments in the early 1990s, known as Clock Tower Place. I kind of got ahead of myself there. That whole building and that whole area is still part of the National Register of Historic Places. If you go by Clock Tower, you'll see on the front of the building in the main entrance, that plaque, the dedication plaque for the National Register of Historic Places. If you go down, if you go down off of Water Street and you go down along the river where the park is, the French Park is actually, you'll come to a little plaque that kind of looks out along the back of the manufacturing building and across kind of like the river, and there's a little blurb in there about the manufacturing company, its history. Some of that information I actually used in the presentation today for you. So you can actually go around and see some of this history that's still there. If you look from the opposite side of the river, from the north side at the old Clock Tower buildings, you will see Nashua Manufacturing Company written on the side of the building. If you look further beyond that, you will actually see that also on some of the buildings behind Clock Tower on like 1 Chestnut Street and the mill buildings that run in between there, the green mills. You'll actually see some indication that those buildings were also part of the Nashua Manufacturing Company at one point. So that's basically it as far as that today, but I also wanted to leave you with a few other things. If this comes out before the Christmas time, definitely please shop small and local. And then also vintage antiques and pre-owned gifts. I mean, they're more popular now than they've ever been. With the ability to give someone something special that's you can't find everywhere because it's not actually being currently manufactured is kind of cool. It's different. It's unique. It says something about that person, and it's a really nice gift to give because it's more thoughtful than just going out and buying whatever's popular on the web these days. Now, if you're looking to buy, look for after the holiday sales. That's always huge. If you're looking to buy, Christmas items or holiday items, a lot of those will be marked down dramatically at your vintage and antique shops locally, directly after the holidays. And then a lot of times, it's a very slow time of year for a lot of the shops that are around. So visiting them through January and February and into March, you'll probably pick up some pretty good sales as folks try to move over some of the inventory that they've carried for a while. So if you're looking to collect, it's a good time to actually get out there in the post-holiday season to actually find some good deals. Now, there are some other places to go other than your regular typical shops. There are still flea markets happening at this time of year in this area. So there is the Milford Antique shows, which are at the Hampshire Hills facility. They're, I think, every Sunday now. And then there's also the Sunday Flea Market, which is in Brookline, New Hampshire, at the Brookline Event Center and Auction Gallery. So you can hit up those two Sunday mornings. The earlier you get there, pretty much the better. I think Brookline opens at 5:30. And I believe if you go on to the website or search the Milford one, you'll see that they start about the same time, but there's different entry level fees based on how early you get there. So just pay attention to that before you go if you don't feel like paying an entry fee to get in. As far as I know, Brookline is always free. So have some great picking out there. Enjoy your winter, stay safe, and have a great one. Good picking.